This might be one of the most common beginner struggles. Your paper bunkles after a few washes just like this. Before I get into fixing paper warping, let me just point out some other reasons that might seem like the same problem, but really comes from using the wrong supply. For example, if you feel like you're not using excessive water, maybe you're just painting small areas or soft details, the paper still warps badly. It's likely not your technique, but your paper choice. Say you use paper that's too thin, such as 120 GSM, 200 GSM, etc. Paper with an undesirable quality or even non-watercolor paper. You could try switching to heavier rated paper. For example, 300 GSM is a typical choice for heavy washed watercolor painting and offers good cost-performance ratio. You might also want to make sure that you're choosing 100% cotton cold-pressed or rough paper to ensure better absorbency. So now let's talk about the actual warping issue I'm going to show you in this video. So this happens when we use a large amount of water for the wet on wet technique. Of course, the paper getting wet and becoming bumpy is not something you've done wrong. Actually, we can see this phenomenon all the time with our paper products, such as a piece of paper, or even napkins shows the same reaction when they get wet. This happens because when you dampen the paper surface, the wet areas expand as the paper fibers absorb water and stretch. However, the surrounding dry areas remain rigid and unchanged. The white center cannot expand freely, so it ends up buckling. As a beginner, you see lots of tutorials using masking tape to stick down all four sides. The paper seems not very buckled after painting. That's not due to using masking tape to help the paper staying flat. That's probably because the painting only has light washes or no washes at all. So if you're using masking tape to stick down all four sides like this and apply a heavy wash, the result will come out like this. Also, you will get a similar outcome using a watercolor block, which is pre-bound and doesn't require taping the paper manually. But as you can see here, fixing all four sides doesn't really help in this situation. It can actually cause the paper to buckle even more unevenly. And based on what we talked earlier, now you know why this seemingly helpful method to keep the paper flat is actually counterproductive if you use heavy washes in your painting. And also, you'll probably come across the advice to stretch your watercolor paper properly. If you haven't heard of this method yet, here's the basic idea. So basically, soak your sheet in clean water or dampen both sides thoroughly with a large brush to get it expand fully. And then tape all four sides down using water-activated tape onto a flat surface. And finally, once it's done flat, you're ready to paint for the wet on wet technique, and it will stay flat even with heavy washes. This is a reliable way to keep your paper perfectly flat. This gives you the chance to fully soak the paper and let it stretch freely before adding the tape. However, in order to follow this method well, you need to prepare all the necessary supplies, which includes water-activated tape, which is different from the masking tape that you may already have, a flat board to secure paper to, a water container large enough to submerge your paper in, scissors, and of course, you need to spend a fair amount of time before you can even get started with your painting. Of course, I'm not here to question the professional way to prep the paper at all. What I want to express is that professional method can certainly guarantee the highest level of precision for the intended purpose. However, they may not always align with the nature of being a learner or meeting the most pressing needs we have at the moment as a beginner. So I came up with a small adjustment to the process and slightly changed the way I paint, so I can continue with my painting as usual while gradually reducing the warping without needing any special prep work. Firstly, I wet the whole page as we would usually for wet on wet technique. At this stage, when the paper is warping, I usually directly dab the colors that I want for this painting, and the color may end up flowing to either side of the page as the middle of the paper has lifted. While I kept adding water paint and spontaneously adjusting the original paint, which is probably already migrating due to the warping, the middle of the paper will go down around about 2 or 3 minutes. If you're feeling patient or if painting on warped paper intimidates you a little, you can wait a few minutes between the initial wetting of the paper and adding your colors. But just make sure that you have thoroughly wetted the paper. You can also paint slightly beyond the borders of the page to ensure thoroughly wetting the paper. This will give the paper time to soak up that water and unwarp, setting back down to become almost flat again. You will notice the paper seems to stick down nicely on the table if you do this, and just as it did with the recommended tape prepping outcome. The difference is, as the wet paper can stay in place, almost stuck on the surface, you don't need to hold the paper down with your non-painting hand whilst you paint. Without the water-activated tape fixed on all sides, you are able to adjust the positioning when painting to enable you to paint from different angles by simply peeling it up and placing it back down on your surface as desired. There are a few minor drawbacks as well. One is that some texture may remain along the edges, but this is barely noticeable. You can either turn it into a torn edge effect or just simply leave as is. Also, the back of the paper might get stained too, depending on how much paint you've used. That's all for today. I hope this video is helpful to you and see you next time.